So as the Minerals Council, we are not climate change denialists. We believe in the science of climate change. We know that carbon does contribute to global warming, as do other greenhouse gas emissions. And from the Minerals Council side, we think that at a global level and at a South African level, we need to be taking action to make sure that we fight climate change, but in a way which is workable for South Africa's economy, and which enables us to transition through this just transition process towards a lower carbon economy. So I think what's interesting is that South Africa's commitments to both the COP on the Paris meetings and the Copenhagen meetings was that South Africa would reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by, I think it was 25% by 2020 and by 35% by 2025 against a business as usual approach. I think it's important to state that in the last decade, we've seen a significant change in the composition of South Africa's economy. The sectors that have grown are mostly low carbon intensive sectors like financial services, real estate, wholesale and retail trades, and the traditional carbon intensive export sectors like mining and manufacturing have actually shrunk. They've actually moved sideways and have not grown at the same pace as the rest of the economy. So that's one component. The other component is that our economy has grown at a far slower pace than people had expected. In the last decade, it was a 1.5% growth rate against people's expectations of a 3% growth rate. So based on our calculations, we think that South Africa is going to achieve its Copenhagen and Paris commitments by 2020 and 2025 if we do nothing, because the economy hasn't grown and because, in the same period, we've seen, for example, in the mining sector, we've seen a 523% increase in the electricity price. And so mining companies have had to improve their energy efficiency. And we've seen 500 megawatts of peak demand power taken off the network by mining companies through demand management processes. So, but having said that, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. And from our side, we've got to look at the full toolbox of measures that should be employed to fight climate change. We are concerned that government is only employing one of the key components at this stage. So the toolbox of measures to fight climate change has to be a set of what we call positive incentives, the carrot issues, and those must be things like offsets, tax incentives, tax-free portions, reward for good performance on improving energy efficiency over time, and even on the carbon budget side, setting yourself a carbon budget and then meeting that carbon budget and reducing your impacts over time. You should be rewarded for that by enabling that to offset against your commitments on the carbon tax side. And then on the other side of the toolbox, you've got obviously penalties, the sticks, as we call them, the big sticks, which is the carbon tax. So, I think if you employ the full range of measures, it's not only the sticks, but you're also putting in place the carrots to enable companies to invest in the green technologies. Of course, one of our big concerns is that at this particular stage, Treasury have implemented the carbon tax. Phase 1 is already in place. Phase 2 coming in obviously in 2023. We have no detail on what the offsets and regulations relating to offsets, budgets, performance, and how you define a trade exposed sector will come through. And we have no visibility on what the tax-free portions may be in 2023. And so planning on what the carbon tax liability is going to be has become quite fraught because of the uncertainties of the lack of the incentive side with just the big penalty put in place. And let's face the reality, a 5.5 billion rand extra cost to the mining sector in 2023 because of a lack of offsets is a massive hit for a very energy intensive sector of our economy. So we have 7 companies that want to develop over 300 megawatts of solar power capability. Now, for mining companies, it makes a lot of sense because it's also a diversification of the energy mix, which is going to help Eskom and help the country along the way. It's a way of hedging your energy costs over time, etc. But the pathways to the regulatory obstacles on the pathway to getting licensing for renewable projects is fraught with some major roadblocks. You have to get a IRP 2010 exemption from the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy now. You have to get a generating license for anything over 10 megawatts from NERSA. That's an interesting process. You then have to get an agreement with Eskom to be able to wheel the electricity on the network, and you're not sure what price they're going to charge, because remember, Eskom still controls the network. It's not an independent system operator with a properly regulated price at this particular stage. And then you have to get all the environmental permitting at both a national, provincial and local government level. So, I mean, effectively, a local government can refuse you an environmental authorization on a fuel tank on a solar plant site, which may end up scuttling the whole issue. So I don't think government have thought about how they create the pathways to make sure that we can invest in these technologies, because ultimately it's good for the country, it's good for our businesses, and it's ultimately good for the planet. And yet the obstacles are very much in the hands of government to resolve. So I think our challenge is that government haven't put in place any of the mechanisms around what the offsets will really look like, especially in 2023. And that's an uncertainty that will have a massive impact on any new investment in energy intensive sectors. What we're asking government to do is to employ the full range of the toolbox, the full set of tools in the toolbox. They've got to give us clarity on the carbon offsets. They've got to give us clarity on the performance incentives. They've got to give us clarity on what the carbon budget process can look like. They've got to give us certainty on if they want to add any extra tax incentives. They've given us a bit on the fact that they'll eliminate the existing tax on electricity, which you pay, the existing tax on electricity, etc. So there's some of those things that they put in place. But without having the full toolbox employed, we're saying to government, you're putting in place a carbon tax, which is big stick, but you're giving us none of the incentives, and those incentives are critical for us to change behavior. Is this about changing behavior? Or was it about raising a tax? I think government as a whole, not just Treasury, need to answer that. And from our side, it's the full toolbox. So we've suggested, and the idea around delaying the implementation until government can employ the full toolbox. Otherwise, they're going to end up penalising carbon-intensive, trade-exposed sectors, which are crucial to South Africa's economy, over the next couple of decades. We're not suggesting that there should never be a carbon tax. Pricing carbon is part of the toolbox. But we're just saying to government, please employ the full set of measures. That'll make sense to everyone.